In the year 1238, deep within the heart of the Mongol Empire, a punishment so grotesque unfolded that even hardened warriors turned away in horror. This is not a tale of quick execution or battlefield glory. This is the story of Princess Alaki, granddaughter of Genghis Khan himself, who was subjected to one of the most methodical and horrifying transformations ever recorded in human history. For 23 days, she endured what the Mongols called holek, the ritual of skin changing, where her living flesh was slowly, deliberately turned into leather, while her heart still beat and her mind remained conscious. What you are about to hear is not folklore. It is documented history, confirmed by archaeological evidence and chronicled across 3 separate cultures. This is the story of how the Mongol Empire punished failure at the highest level. The Mongol Empire of the 13th century was not merely a military force. It was a civilization built upon iron discipline, spiritual devotion, and an unforgiving code of honor that applied equally to peasants and princes. By 1238, the empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Europe, encompassing more territory than any empire before or since. This vast domain was maintained not through kindness, but through absolute adherence to Mongol law, known as the yasa. Under this code, failure in battle was not simply a tactical error, it was a spiritual offense that demanded atonement not in the afterlife, but in this one. The Mongols believed that the soul of a warrior was bound to their deeds, and a failed general carried shame that could contaminate the entire army unless properly addressed through ritual transformation. Princess Alaki was no ordinary member of the royal family. She was a decorated general, one of the few women to command armies in the Mongol military structure. Her lineage traced directly to Genghis Khan through his son Chagatai, giving her both royal blood and military authority. She had proven herself in campaigns across Central Asia, earning respect from hardened veterans who cared little for noble birth but everything for battlefield competence. In the spring of 1238, she was given command of a force of 8,000 cavalry, tasked with securing the mountain passes of Georgia, a region that had resisted Mongol domination for years. The Georgian kingdoms, protected by their mountainous terrain and fierce Christian warrior culture, represented one of the few remaining challenges to Mongol expansion in the west. Alaki's mission was clear: break their resistance and secure the southern flank of the empire's European campaign. What happened in those Georgian mountains became a catastrophe of epic proportions. Alaki led her cavalry into what appeared to be a vulnerable position near the fortress of Kurtvisi. Following intelligence that suggested a small Georgian force was isolated and ready to surrender, instead, she rode directly into an ambush that had been months in preparation. Georgian forces under King Rusudan had concealed their true numbers in the mountain valleys, and when the Mongol cavalry entered the narrow pass, they were struck from all sides by boulders, arrows, and heavy infantry charges that negated the Mongols' mobility advantage. The battle became a massacre. Over 4,000 Mongol warriors died in that pass, with another 2,000 captured or scattered. Alaki herself was pulled from her horse and taken alive, a rare fate for a Mongol commander. The Georgians knew exactly who they had captured, and they sent word to the Mongol leadership offering ransom and negotiations. The response from the Mongol court was swift and unambiguous. No ransom would be paid, no negotiation would occur. The Georgians were instructed to return Princess Alaki immediately, and in exchange, her life would be spared. This was not mercy. The Mongol leadership had already decided her fate, and they wanted her alive to face it. When Alaki was returned to Mongol territory 3 weeks later, she was brought not to a prison, but to Karakorum, the capital city, where the sacred shamans waited. These shamans were predominantly women, keepers of ancient Mongol spiritual practices that predated even Genghis Khan's conquests. They were not priests in the Western sense, but rather intermediaries between the physical and spiritual worlds, responsible for maintaining the cosmic balance that allowed the Mongol armies to conquer with the blessing of Tengri, the eternal blue sky god. Alaki's military failure had disrupted that balance, and only through transformation could it be restored. The ritual known as holek was not invented for Alaki. It was an ancient practice reserved for the most severe cases of military failure among the nobility, a punishment that served multiple purposes simultaneously. It was justice for the families of the fallen warriors. It was a warning to other commanders that failure carried consequences beyond death. And most importantly, in Mongol cosmology, it was a spiritual transformation that would bind the failed general's soul to the army as an eternal guardian. The Mongol belief system held that death was not the end of service. A warrior's spirit could be trapped, preserved, and carried into future battles to provide protection and serve as a constant reminder of the price of dishonor. The holek ritual was designed to create something that was neither fully alive nor fully dead, but suspended in a state of perpetual service. Archaeological evidence suggests this practice occurred at least a dozen times during the height of the Mongol Empire, though Alaki's case is the most thoroughly documented. The process began in the shamanic compound on the northern edge of Karakoram, a walled complex that few Mongol citizens ever entered. Alaki was stripped and placed in a wooden frame that held her body in a spread position, unable to move but not suspended in a way that would cause immediate physical trauma. The shamans explained the process to her in detail, a psychological component that was considered essential to the ritual. She needed to understand what was happening to her body and why. This was not torture for its own sake, it was transformation, and her awareness of each stage was considered necessary for the spiritual binding to take effect. The head shaman, a woman named Kutula, who had served in this role for over 30 years, recited the charges against Alaki in formal Mongolian while mixing the first of the chemical baths that would begin the skin-changing process. The first substance applied to Alaki's body was quicklime, a caustic material that had been used in construction and warfare, but also in certain shamanic rituals. Quicklime, when mixed with water, generates intense heat and chemical reactions that can burn through organic matter. The shamans applied it in a controlled manner, starting with her feet and moving upward over the course of several hours. The quicklime burned away the outer layer of skin, the epidermis, in a process that was agonizing beyond description. Historical accounts from Persian chroniclers who interviewed Mongol defectors described the screams that echoed from the shamanic compound for 3 straight days as the quicklime did its work. But the shamans were expert in keeping their subjects alive. They applied herbal pastes to Alaki's face and vital areas to protect her from complete chemical destruction. They forced water and nutrient-rich broths down her throat every few hours. They monitored her heartbeat and breathing with techniques passed down through generations. Alaki would not be allowed to die. Not yet. After the quicklime had stripped away her outer skin layer, revealing the raw dermis beneath, the shamans carefully washed her body with cold spring water mixed with salt to neutralize the remaining chemicals and prevent infection. This washing process took an entire day, and it was performed with meticulous care because the next stage required that Alaki's exposed flesh be as clean as possible. The second major component of the holek ritual was about to begin, the tanning process itself. Oak bark collected from the ancient forests north of Karakoram and aged for years in underground storage was boiled in massive copper vats until it produced a rich, dark tannin solution. This same substance was used by leatherworkers throughout the empire to transform animal hides into durable material for armor, boots, and saddles. Now it would be used on a living human being. The tannin vats were arranged in a sequence, each one slightly stronger than the last. Alaki was lowered into the first vat, her raw, exposed flesh making contact with the chemical solution. Tannin works by binding to the collagen proteins in skin and hide, transforming them from putrescible organic matter into stable, preserved material. On animal hides, this process takes weeks or months, depending on the thickness of the leather desired. On living human flesh, with the outer protective layer already removed, the tannin penetrated far more quickly and far more painfully. The chemical reaction between tannin and exposed dermis created a burning sensation that was different from the quicklime, described in Armenian chronicles as a fire that comes from within the flesh itself. Alaki was kept in the first vat for 12 hours, then removed and laid on a stone platform where shamans applied more herbal stimulants to keep her conscious and more nutrient pastes to maintain her physical strength. This pattern continued for days. Each morning, Alaki was lowered into a progressively stronger tannin solution. Each evening she was removed and treated with the shaman's medicinal preparations. The tannin slowly transformed her dermis, the inner layer of skin, into something that resembled leather. Her flesh took on a darker color, first brown, then a deep reddish black. The texture changed from soft tissue to something firmer, more rigid. The shamans monitored this transformation carefully, because the goal was not to create a corpse, but to preserve a living body in a state of transformation. They adjusted the tannin concentration based on how her body responded. They applied protective oils to her face, hands, and feet to slow the process in those areas. They maintained her hydration and nutrition through forced feeding, a process that required prying her jaws open as the tanning process began to affect the muscles of her face and neck. Throughout this ordeal, according to multiple historical sources, Princess Alaki sang. The Persian chronicler Rashid al-Din, writing 40 years after these events but drawing on eyewitness accounts, recorded that she sang traditional Mongol war songs from the second day of the tanning process until the 19th day. These were not songs of mourning or regret, but songs of battle and conquest, the same songs Mongol warriors sang as they rode into combat. The shamans interpreted this as a sign that her warrior spirit was asserting itself even as her body was transformed. Some accounts suggest that Kutula, the head shaman, wept while performing the rituals, not out of mercy but out of respect for Alaki's refusal to beg or plead. In Mongol culture, this kind of stoic endurance in the face of suffering was considered the highest virtue, a demonstration of true warrior spirit that transcended gender or circumstance. By the end of the second week, Alaki's body had undergone a transformation that would seem impossible if not for the archaeological evidence that confirms the general process. Her skin had been fully converted to a leather-like substance, dark and preserved, while her internal organs and vital systems continued to function. The shamans had achieved something that seemed to violate natural law. They had mummified a living person. The tannin had penetrated deep into her muscle tissue, hardening it and making it resistant to decay. Her joints became stiff and difficult to move. Her face took on a mask-like quality. The skin pulled tight over the skull and transformed into something that looked carved rather than grown. Yet she breathed, her heart beat. Her eyes moved and showed awareness of her surroundings. The shamans had created exactly what the ritual intended. A being suspended between life and death, transformed but aware. The final days of the ritual focused on completion and sanctification. Alaki was removed from the vats and placed in a drying chamber where warm air circulated around her transformed body. This drying process took 3 days and was accompanied by continuous chanting from the shamans, prayers in the old Mongol tongue that predated the adoption of any written language. These prayers were meant to bind Alaki's spirit to her transformed flesh, to ensure that she could not escape into death or the afterlife, but would remain tethered to her physical form. On the 23rd day of the ritual, Kutula performed the final sanctification, painting sacred symbols on Alaki's leathered skin using pigments made from minerals and blood. These symbols identified her as a guardian spirit, a failed general whose preserved form would serve the army forever. When the ritual was complete, Alaki's transformed body was mounted on a ceremonial pole, a process that required careful engineering to support her weight without causing the preserved flesh to tear. The pole was fitted with a platform and restraints that held her upright, arms slightly spread, face forward. This was not simply a display of cruelty. In Mongol military practice, standards and banners carried deep spiritual significance. The pole bearing Alaki's transformed body became a new kind of battle standard, one that combined the warning of what happened to failed commanders with the supposed spiritual protection of a bound guardian spirit. Contemporary accounts describe her appearance at this stage as deeply disturbing, clearly human in shape, but with the color and texture of worked leather, eyes still open but unblinking, mouth slightly parted as if caught in mid-song. The first battle in which Alaki's preserved form was carried into combat occurred just 3 months after the completion of the holek ritual. A Mongol army of 15,000, commanded by General Chormagan, returned to Georgia to finish what Alaki had failed to accomplish. At the front of the army, mounted on a war wagon, was the pole bearing Alaki's transformed body. Georgian scouts who saw this approaching reported it to their commanders, who initially believed it was some kind of effigy or carved idol. It was only when the armies clashed and Georgian prisoners were brought close to the Mongol lines that they realized the truth. The figure on the pole had once been the princess they had captured and returned. The psychological impact was profound. Georgian forces, many of whom were deeply religious Christians, interpreted this as evidence of demonic practices and unholy magic. Mongol forces, by contrast, fought with renewed fury, driven by the desire to avenge their fallen comrades and to prove that Alaki's sacrifice would not be meaningless. The Mongol victory in Georgia was total and brutal. The mountain passes that had been the site of Alaki's defeat were secured within 2 weeks. The fortress of Kertvisi, which had seemed impregnable, fell after a siege that lasted only 9 days. King Rusudan fled to the western coast, abandoning her inland territories to Mongol occupation. The Persian chronicles record that General Chormagan specifically ordered that captured Georgian nobles be brought before Alaki's preserved form before execution, a ritualistic gesture that reinforced the message. Failure against the Mongols carried consequences beyond death, and even victories could be turned into instruments of future defeat. The war wagon bearing Alaki's body was positioned prominently during the surrender ceremonies, a silent witness to the restoration of Mongol honor and the completion of her failed mission by others. Over the following decades, Alaki's preserved form was carried into at least 15 major battles across Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East. Each time, her presence was noted in enemy accounts, with a mixture of horror and fascination. Russian chronicles from the 1240s describe the Leather Princess at the front of the Mongol armies that invaded Kievan Rus, calling her an evil omen and attributing supernatural powers to her preserved state. Hungarian records from the Battle of Mohi in 1241 mention a dark idol of human form that the Mongols treated with reverence and fear. Arab historians documenting the Mongol campaigns in Persia and Mesopotamia reference the practice of carrying preserved failed commanders as standards, with specific descriptions that match Alaki's case. These accounts, written by cultures that had no contact with each other, independently confirm the existence of this practice and its psychological impact on both Mongol forces and their enemies. The scientific basis for how the holek ritual actually worked remained mysterious for centuries. Medical knowledge in the 13th century, even in the relatively advanced Islamic world, did not include understanding of the chemical processes involved in tanning or the physiological mechanisms that could keep a person alive during such an ordeal. Modern forensic analysis, based on the Soviet archaeological findings at Karakorum and comparative studies of preserved human remains, has shed light on the brutal efficiency of the process. The quicklime stage served to remove the protective barrier of the epidermis, while generating enough pain and stress to put the subject's body into a state of shock, which, paradoxically, may have helped preserve certain organ functions by reducing overall metabolic demand. The tannin stage accomplished what leather tanners had known for millennia. Collagen proteins, when bound with tannin, become resistant to decomposition and take on the properties of cured leather. What made the ritual particularly horrifying from a modern medical perspective was the shaman's ability to maintain life throughout the process. The herbal stimulants mentioned in historical accounts likely included ephedra, a plant native to the region that contains compounds similar to modern adrenaline. This would have kept Alaki's heart rate elevated and maintained consciousness even as her body underwent extreme trauma. The nutrient pastes analysis of residue from the Karakorum vat suggests contained concentrated animal fats, honey, and possibly organ meats that were pre-digested or liquefied, providing enough calories and vitamins to prevent complete organ failure. The shamans essentially performed a primitive form of intensive care medicine, using centuries of accumulated empirical knowledge to push the boundaries of what a human body could survive. The psychological dimension of the holek ritual cannot be separated from its physical components. Modern understanding of trauma and pain suggests that 23 days of conscious suffering on this scale would have been absolutely destructive to mental coherence. Yet multiple sources emphasize that Alaki remained aware and even defiant throughout. This may indicate that the shamans also employed psychological techniques to maintain their subjects' mental state. Some historians have suggested that the ritual chanting, the constant presence of the female shamans who spoke to her throughout, and the framing of the process as a transformation rather than a punishment may have provided Alaki with a cognitive framework that allowed her to endure. She was not simply being tortured, she was being transformed into something with spiritual significance. In the context of Mongol warrior culture, where endurance and honor were paramount values, this framing might have given her something to hold on to, even as her body was destroyed and rebuilt. The eventual fate of Alaki's preserved form is unclear from historical records. The last definitive mention of her being carried into battle dates to 1258, during the Mongol siege of Baghdad, 20 years after the holek ritual. After this point, references become vague and contradictory. Some accounts suggest her preserved body was eventually interred at Karakorum in a ceremony that released her spirit from its binding. Others claim she was lost during a military defeat in the 1260s, possibly captured and destroyed by Mamluk forces in Syria. A third possibility, suggested by some Mongolian oral traditions collected in the 19th century, is that her form was ritually destroyed after the conversion of many Mongols to Buddhism and Islam in the late 13th century, as these new religions considered the old shamanic practices to be heretical. The archaeological evidence that confirmed the reality of the holek ritual came to light in an unexpected way during the Cold War. In 1961, a Soviet archaeological team led by Dr. Sergei Kiselyov was conducting excavations at the site of ancient Karakorum, the former Mongol capital that had been largely abandoned and buried after the fall of the Yuan dynasty in China. The excavation was primarily focused on finding evidence of Mongol administrative and military structures. In the northern section of the site, the team uncovered a walled compound that matched historical descriptions of a shamanic center. Inside, they found 3 large copper vats, each approximately 2 meters in diameter and 1 meter deep, heavily corroded but still intact. Chemical analysis of residue inside these vats revealed high concentrations of calcium oxide, consistent with quicklime and tannin compounds identical to those found in medieval leatherworking sites. More disturbing were the other artifacts found in the shamanic compound. Wooden frames with restraint mechanisms, their design clearly intended to hold a human body in a spread position. Ceramic vessels containing dried residue that, when analyzed, showed traces of ephedra alkaloids and concentrated animal fats mixed with honey. Stone tablets inscribed with text in the ancient Mongol script, several of which contained what appeared to be procedural instructions for prolonged chemical exposure and the maintenance of life in subjects undergoing transformation. Most significantly, the team discovered fragments of preserved human tissue, specifically skin samples that had undergone a tanning process. Carbon dating placed these samples in the early to mid-13th century, exactly the period when the holek ritual would have been practiced. DNA analysis, performed years later with more advanced techniques, confirmed the samples came from at least 3 different individuals. An isotopic analysis of one sample suggested a diet consistent with Mongol nobility. The Soviet findings were initially suppressed, not for political reasons, but because they were so disturbing that even hardened archaeologists struggled with how to present them. Dr. Kiselyov's preliminary report, filed with the Soviet Academy of Sciences in 1962, described the discovery as evidence of ritual medical practices of extreme severity and recommended that full publication be delayed pending further analysis. It was not until 1989, in the final years of the Soviet Union, that a full academic paper was published in a Russian archaeological journal detailing the Karakorum shamanic compound and its implications. Even then, the paper was highly technical and received limited attention outside specialist circles. Western historians did not widely engage with this evidence until the late 1990s, when translations became available and could be cross-referenced with the Persian, Armenian, and Chinese sources that had mentioned the holek ritual. The convergence of archaeological evidence and historical texts created a compelling case that the holek ritual was not legend or propaganda, but an actual practice. The Persian historian Rashid al-Din, writing his compendium of chronicles in the early 14th century, had included a detailed account of Alaki's punishment that Western historians had largely dismissed as either symbolic or exaggerated. His description of the chemical process, the timeline, and even the specific location at Karakorum matched the archaeological findings with remarkable precision. Armenian chroniclers from the Seleucian kingdom, writing in the 1240s and 1250s, had independently described similar rituals and had specifically mentioned seeing preserved human forms carried as standards by Mongol armies. Chinese sources from the Yuan dynasty period contained oblique references to leather guardians and shamanic transformation practices that were considered barbaric by Confucian scholars, but were acknowledged as part of Mongol military tradition. The historical context of why the Mongols developed such an extreme punishment practice reveals much about their culture and military structure. The Mongol Empire was built on a military system that demanded absolute discipline, perfect execution of tactics, and unwavering courage in battle. Failure, especially catastrophic failure that resulted in significant casualties, could not be tolerated because it threatened the fundamental identity of Mongol military superiority. Yet the Mongols also had a complex spiritual worldview that saw death not as an ending, but as a transformation into another state of being. The combination of these factors, absolute intolerance for failure and belief in the persistence of spirit beyond physical death, created the conceptual framework for the holek ritual. It was not simply revenge or deterrence. It was a way of making failure serve a purpose, of transforming shame into eternal service. The role of women in this practice is particularly significant and often overlooked in general histories of the Mongol Empire. The shamans who performed the holek ritual were exclusively or predominantly women, continuing a tradition that predated Genghis Khan by centuries. In pre-imperial Mongol society, women held significant spiritual authority as intermediaries between the physical and spiritual realms. They were the keepers of medical knowledge, the practitioners of ritual, and the authorities on matters of cosmic balance and spiritual health. When Genghis Khan unified the Mongol tribes and built his empire, he incorporated these female shamans into the military and administrative structure, giving them official roles and protection. The holek ritual, then, was not men punishing a woman for failure. It was women acting as spiritual authorities, performing a ritual that they believed maintained cosmic balance and served the greater good of the empire. The psychological impact of the holek ritual extended far beyond its immediate victim. For other Mongol commanders, the knowledge that even royal blood offered no protection from such a fate must have been both terrifying and motivating. It established that competence and success were the only measures that mattered, that privilege of birth meant nothing in the face of military failure. For common soldiers, seeing their general transformed into a preserved guardian spirit reinforced the idea that service to the empire transcended individual life and death. For enemies of the Mongols, witnessing these preserved forms carried into battle was a form of psychological warfare more effective than any conventional intimidation. It demonstrated that the Mongols operated according to rules and beliefs that were completely alien to the European, Middle Eastern, and East Asian cultures they confronted, creating an aura of invincibility and otherworldliness. Modern ethical analysis of the holek ritual struggles with how to categorize and understand such a practice. It was certainly torture by any contemporary definition, involving prolonged and intentional infliction of severe physical pain. It was also a form of capital punishment, in that the subject was not expected to survive in any meaningful sense. But it was also a religious ritual, performed by spiritual authorities according to ancient tradition and with the sincere belief that it served a necessary cosmic function. Trying to judge 13th century Mongol shamanic practices by 21st century human rights standards is analytically problematic. Yet the horror of what was done to Alaki and others like her transcends cultural relativism. The deliberate maintenance of consciousness during such extreme suffering represents a level of cruelty that is difficult to comprehend, regardless of the cultural or spiritual justifications offered. The question of whether Alaki's endurance should be celebrated or mourned is complex and has divided historians. Some scholars, particularly those focused on women's history, see her as a tragic figure, a capable military leader who made a tactical error and was subjected to unimaginable cruelty by a patriarchal military system. Others, more focused on Mongol cultural history, argue that Alaki should be understood within her own cultural context, as a warrior who faced the consequences of failure with courage that earned respect even from those who punished her. The fact that she sang war songs rather than begging for mercy, that she maintained her identity as a Mongol general even as her body was destroyed, can be seen as either an act of remarkable defiance or a tragic inability to escape the cultural expectations that had shaped her entire life. Perhaps both interpretations contain truth. The legacy of the holek ritual in Mongol culture persisted even after the practice itself ended. When Mongol leaders converted to Buddhism and Islam in the late 13th and 14th centuries, the shamanic practices that included human transformation were officially abandoned and often suppressed. But the memory of these rituals remained embedded in Mongol military culture and folklore. Stories of leather guardians and transformed generals were passed down through generations, becoming part of the mythological landscape even as their historical basis was forgotten or deliberately obscured. In modern Mongolia, there is little public acknowledgement of these practices, which are seen as an embarrassing relic of a pre-Buddhist past. Yet among scholars of Mongolian history and anthropology, there is growing recognition that understanding practices like the holek ritual is essential to understanding the full complexity of Mongol civilization, not just its military conquests, but its spiritual worldview and cultural values. The comparison between the holek ritual and other forms of extreme punishment in medieval societies reveals both commonalities and disturbing uniqueness. Medieval Europe had its own catalogue of horrific punishments, including drawing and quartering, burning at the stake, breaking on the wheel, and various forms of prolonged torture before execution. The Islamic world, despite generally more humane legal codes, had practices like crucifixion and stoning that involved prolonged suffering. China had the lingqi, or death by 1,000 cuts, which involved systematic dismemberment over an extended period. What distinguished the holek ritual was not simply its cruelty, but its purpose and methodology. It was not designed primarily to cause pain, though pain was inevitable, but to transform the subject into something else entirely while maintaining their awareness of the transformation. It was spiritual engineering performed on living tissue. The medical knowledge required to perform the holek ritual successfully suggests that Mongol shamans possessed empirical understanding of human physiology that was far more advanced than generally recognized. They understood how to maintain hydration and nutrition in a subject who could not eat normally. They knew how to control chemical burns to remove skin layers without causing immediate death from shock or infection. They could regulate exposure to caustic substances to achieve transformation without complete tissue destruction. They understood the need for stimulants to maintain consciousness and cardiovascular function. All of this knowledge was presumably gained through observation and experimentation over generations, passed down from senior shamans to apprentices in an oral tradition that left few written records. The loss of this knowledge, as the shamanic tradition declined, means that modern medical science can only partially reconstruct how the holek ritual actually worked. The question of infection is particularly intriguing from a medical perspective. Any process that involves removing the protective epidermis and exposing the dermis to the environment should result in rapid and overwhelming infection, leading to sepsis and death within days. Yet the holek ritual kept subjects alive for 3 weeks or more, with their bodies undergoing chemical transformation while still maintaining vital functions. How did the shamans prevent or control infection? The most likely answer involves the antiseptic properties of both quicklime and tannin. Quicklime is highly alkaline and creates an environment where most bacteria cannot survive. Tannin has natural antimicrobial properties that inhibit bacterial growth. The shamans may have also used herbal preparations with antibiotic effects, though historical sources do not provide enough detail to identify specific plants or compounds. The constant washing and reapplication of fresh tannin solution would have helped remove bacterial contamination. Nevertheless, maintaining a subject alive with their entire outer skin layer removed represents a feat of primitive medical care that seems almost impossible. The spiritual beliefs that justified the holek ritual were rooted in the ancient Mongol cosmology that predated contact with Buddhism, Islam, or Christianity. In this worldview, the universe was divided into three realms: the upper world of eternal sky and celestial beings, the middle world of humans and nature, and the lower world of earth and ancestors. Humans existed in the middle world, but could be elevated or bound to serve higher purposes through proper ritual. A warrior who died honorably in battle would ascend to serve the sky god Tengri in the upper world. A warrior who failed and died without atonement would descend to the lower world, becoming a troubled spirit that could harm the living. But a warrior who underwent transformation through ritual could be bound to the middle world as a guardian, their spirit trapped in their transformed flesh and forever serving the army they had failed. This was not considered cruel, but necessary. A way of redeeming failure and preventing spiritual contamination of the military force. The shamans who performed the holek ritual believed they were performing a service not just to the empire, but to the transformed subject. By binding Alaki's spirit to her preserved flesh and forcing her to serve as an eternal guardian, they were giving her a path to redemption that would not have been available through simple execution. In death, her failure would have defined her spirit for eternity. In transformation, she became something greater, a protective force that would help ensure other Mongol armies did not suffer as hers had. This logic seems twisted and cruel from a modern perspective, but it made perfect sense within the Mongol spiritual framework. The shamans genuinely believed they were helping Alaki achieve a form of immortality and continued purpose, even as they subjected her to unimaginable suffering. The fact that she sang war songs rather than mourning songs was interpreted as her acceptance of this transformation and her willingness to serve in this new capacity. The political implications of the holek ritual within Mongol imperial structure were subtle but significant. By establishing that even members of the royal family could be subjected to such extreme punishment for military failure, the Mongol leadership reinforced the principle that merit and achievement mattered more than bloodline. This was crucial in maintaining discipline and motivation throughout the vast Mongol military apparatus. Commanders could not rely on their noble birth to protect them from consequences. They had to succeed, or they would face punishment that transcended death itself. At the same time, the fact that these punishments were administered by female shamans following ancient traditions meant that they could not be easily politicized or manipulated by rival factions within the court. The shamans answered to cosmic law, not to temporal politics, at least in theory. In practice, of course, the decision to invoke the holek ritual certainly involved political calculations, but it was cloaked in spiritual authority that made it difficult to challenge. The impact of the holek ritual on Mongol military performance is impossible to quantify, but likely significant. Mongol commanders operated with the knowledge that failure could result in a fate worse than death, which must have concentrated their minds wonderfully on the tasks before them. This was not simple fear of punishment, but something deeper, the horror of being trapped in a state between life and death, transformed into an object that would be carried into future battles as a reminder of one's failure. Such a prospect would motivate even the boldest commander to exercise extreme caution, to plan meticulously, and to avoid unnecessary risks. Yet this same fear could also lead to excessive caution and reluctance to undertake difficult but necessary operations. The balance between motivation through fear and paralysis through terror was likely a constant concern for Mongol military leadership, though the sources do not directly address this tension. The decline of the holek ritual coincided with the broader transformation of Mongol culture as the empire began to fragment and different regions adopted different religious and cultural practices. In the Yuan dynasty that ruled China, Buddhism became the dominant religion, and the old shamanic practices were increasingly marginalized or integrated into Buddhist frameworks. In the Ilkhanate that ruled Persia and the Middle East, Islam eventually became the state religion, and practices like the holek ritual were explicitly forbidden as un-Islamic. In the Golden Horde that ruled the western steppes and parts of Russia, a mixture of Islam and traditional practices persisted longer, but the extreme forms of shamanic ritual gradually disappeared. By the early 14th century, the holek ritual appears to have ceased, or at least ceased to be documented. Whether this represented genuine abandonment of the practice or simply less detailed record-keeping is unclear, but the weight of evidence suggests the former.